They say the streets reveal who we truly are. But on one ordinary afternoon, those streets became the stage for a humiliation that should never have happened. A woman, calm, professional, simply going about her day, was suddenly reduced to nothing more than a target. Not because she had done anything wrong. Not because she posed a threat. But because of the color of her skin. It started with a look, cold, dismissive, the kind of look that cuts deeper than words ever could. Then came the words themselves, spat out like venom. A uniformed officer, sworn to protect and serve, used his authority not to defend, but to degrade. He called her trash. A single word, heavy with centuries of prejudice, spoken in broad daylight where strangers could hear. The air shifted. People walking by slowed down, pretending not to watch yet unable to look away. Some shook their heads. Others kept their distance. No one intervened. And for a moment, this woman stood there, exposed to the full weight of someone else's contempt. She did not shout. She did not fight back. She only stared, steady, controlled, but burning inside. Because what the officer didn't know, what he couldn't possibly imagine, was who he had just chosen to humiliate. She wasn't powerless. She wasn't someone who would silently carry the insult home and swallow the pain. She had a strength he could never anticipate, a power rooted not in rage but in truth. But in that instant, the story wasn't about power. It was about pain. How many times had she seen this happen to others? How many times had she felt the sting of being underestimated, belittled, dismissed, simply for existing? This moment was more than a personal insult. It was a reminder of how deeply prejudice runs, how it hides behind badges and uniforms, pretending to be authority when it's really just hate dressed in blue. The crowd eventually dispersed. The officer, satisfied with his cruelty, walked away, believing he had won. But he was wrong. Because a single phone call, one quiet, deliberate action, would soon change everything. The stage was set for a reversal so shocking that the very foundation of that officer's arrogance would collapse in seconds. The woman he called trash was not just anyone. She carried a title that demanded respect, authority, and dignity. And when he learned the truth, his world would flip upside down. But the real story isn't just about what happened between them. It's about what this moment reveals about us, about justice, about dignity, about the hidden battles fought every day in silence. So the question is, when prejudice speaks louder than duty, what happens when the truth finally answers back? Before that afternoon on the street, before the insult that would echo in her mind, she was simply living her life like anyone else. Her mornings began early, sometimes before the sun had even stretched over the skyline. She was disciplined, not because life had been easy, but because she had learned long ago that discipline was survival. In a world that constantly underestimated her, structure became her armor. She worked in silence, her coffee steaming on the counter, her phone buzzing with messages she had no time to answer. While others might still be wrestling with alarm clocks, she was already up, pressing her uniform, polishing her shoes, preparing herself to meet the world with excellence. To most people, she was invisible. Just another woman walking with confidence, keeping to herself, not asking for anyone's attention. But beneath that calm surface was a story forged in fire. She had grown up watching the world change around her, watching neighborhoods decline, watching friends slip away into lives that promised nothing but hardship. And she had decided early that she would not let the weight of history crush her spirit. Education was her first battlefield. She sat in classrooms where teachers doubted her potential, where classmates whispered that she didn't belong, where every success was questioned, every failure magnified. Yet she pushed forward, collecting degrees like stepping stones, climbing higher when others tried to pull her down. Her family had always told her, "You have to work twice as hard for half the respect." And she had lived by that rule. Not bitterly, but with quiet determination. While others rested, she worked. While others settled, she rose. And eventually, she rose so high that even those who doubted her had to stand in silence. She reached a position that only a handful ever touch, a role of authority, responsibility, and power. But she never bragged. She never wore her title like a crown. To her, it wasn't about ego. It was about service. Protecting people. Upholding dignity. Making sure no one else endured the kinds of wounds she had carried. Still, the world didn't see the whole of her. Strangers on the street didn't know her journey. They didn't see the years of sacrifice, the endless nights of study, the weight of responsibility she carried with grace. They only saw the surface, a black woman, walking alone, blending into the background of a busy city. And that's why what happened that day cut so deeply. Because it wasn't new. It wasn't shocking to her that someone would look at her and see less than what she was. She had experienced it before, in whispers, in stares, in the subtle ways doors sometimes closed before she even knocked. But this time, it was different. This time, the insult wasn't hidden behind a polite smile or veiled language. It was hurled at her, raw and venomous, by someone wearing the very uniform she had devoted her life to honoring. Think about that for a moment. The uniform meant to protect had turned against her. The oath meant to defend justice had been twisted into a weapon. The word trash carried more than one man's contempt. It carried the weight of every injustice she had endured, every moment society had tried to erase her worth. But before that instant on the street, her life was full of the ordinary routines and quiet victories that made her human. She loved reading on quiet evenings. She called her mother every Sunday. She laughed too loudly at old family stories, the kind that never lost their humor no matter how many times they were told. She mentored young women, reminding them that their voices mattered, that their dreams were worth fighting for. She was a woman of balance, tough in her work, gentle in her heart. And that balance made her both deeply respected and quietly underestimated. To her colleagues, she was firm but fair. To her friends, she was loyal and steady. To strangers, she was just another face in the crowd. And that is the cruel irony of racism, it doesn't care who you are. It doesn't ask about your sacrifices, your triumphs, or your humanity. It reduces you to a label, a stereotype, a target. And on that day, all her years of achievement, all her battles won, all her dignity, were reduced in the officer's eyes to a single word, trash. But this story isn't just about one insult. It's about what happens when arrogance collides with truth. Because while the officer believed he had humiliated her, he had unknowingly walked into the kind of lesson life delivers only once. The phone call that would follow wasn't just a moment of personal vindication. It was a mirror held up to an entire system, a reminder that respect cannot be demanded with force, it must be earned through humanity. And so, as she walked away that day, her step steady, her head held high, she already knew something the officer did not, that the story was far from over. That his words would not be the final chapter. That truth always finds its way to the surface. The stage was set. The pieces were in motion. What began as humiliation was about to transform into a lesson the world would never forget. Because sometimes, the quietest strength delivers the loudest justice. The insult was just the spark. What followed was the fire. When the officer's words cut through the air, trash, it wasn't just an insult tossed casually into the wind. It was delivered with venom, with a sneer that told everyone nearby exactly what he thought of her. And in that moment, all eyes turned toward her, waiting to see how she would react. She stood still, frozen in that fragile space between anger and silence. Part of her wanted to shout, to unleash every ounce of frustration built up over years of silent battles. But she knew better. In a world where a black woman's raised voice could be twisted into aggression, she chose stillness. Her silence was not weakness, it was control. But silence didn't stop him. The officer stepped closer, his boots heavy on the concrete, each stride meant to intimidate. He adjusted his belt, rested his hand near his holster, not because he needed to, but because he could. His presence screamed of power misused, of authority bent toward cruelty. "Move along," he barked, his tone sharp and dismissive. "People like you don't belong standing here." The word stung worse than the insult. People like you. He didn't even bother to disguise the prejudice. He didn't care who heard. The weight of centuries sat behind those words, pressing down on her shoulders, reminding her of every time society tried to erase her worth. The crowd, uneasy but unwilling to step in, shuffled away one by one. Some lowered their heads, pretending not to hear. Others stole quick glances, shame and fear etched across their faces. And she was left standing, alone, against the full weight of his authority. Inside, her heart pounded. Not from fear, but from fury. She had spent years proving herself, breaking barriers, carrying the burden of respectability on her back. She had dedicated her life to serving justice. And now here she was, reduced to trash in the eyes of a man who wore the same badge she had sworn to honor. She wanted to say something. To reveal who she truly was. To strip the smug grin from his face with a single sentence, "I am the state police chief." But she didn't. Not yet. Because she understood something he didn't. Timing mattered. And the lesson about to unfold would be sharper, deeper, and far more humiliating if she let him believe his power was absolute. Still, the encounter escalated. He circled her like a predator, muttering under his breath, loud enough for her to hear but quiet enough that no one else would catch it. Words dripping with contempt. Questions about where she was going, why she was there, what gave her the right to stand on that corner as though the city belonged to him. Every question was an accusation. Every glance a threat. And every second that passed, the tension thickened, wrapping around her like chains. But she stood tall. Her posture straight, her gaze unwavering. She gave him nothing, no fear, no anger, no weakness to exploit. Her silence became its own kind of resistance, its own act of defiance. And that silence unnerved him. Because bullies thrive on reaction. They feed on visible pain. And when they don't get it, they grow reckless. So he leaned closer. His voice dropped, cold and sharp. Don't make me treat you the way people like you deserve. That was the breaking point. Not for her, but for the story itself. Because those words would soon come back to haunt him in ways he couldn't yet imagine. She pulled out her phone. Slowly. Deliberately. Not to film him, not to argue with him, but to make a call. Her movements were calm, almost casual, but they carried a weight that made him pause. He didn't know who she was calling. He didn't know what power rested behind her fingertips. And in that brief hesitation, the balance began to shift. The call connected. Her voice was steady, professional, stripped of the pain he had tried to inflict. She spoke a name. She gave a location. She said nothing else. And when she hung up, she looked at him, not with anger, but with quiet certainty. That certainty rattled him. Because suddenly, he realized he didn't know who he was dealing with. The confidence in her eyes suggested something bigger than what he had assumed. But pride is a dangerous thing. Instead of stepping back, instead of considering the possibility that he had overstepped, he doubled down. He smirked, puffed out his chest, and muttered, "Call whoever you want. It won't change what you are." But oh, how wrong he was. Minutes passed. The street seemed to grow quieter, as though holding its breath. She stood motionless, waiting. He shifted, his bravado slipping ever so slightly as time stretched on. And then, in the distance, came the sound that would change everything. The crunch of tires rolling to a stop, the slam of car doors, the heavy footsteps approaching fast. The officer straightened, expecting backup. Expecting his colleagues to support him, to reinforce his authority. He was ready to put on a performance, to paint her as uncooperative, difficult, unworthy of respect. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly predict, was that the people stepping onto that sidewalk weren't there for him. They weren't coming to back him up. They were coming to look directly at her. And when they did, the air shifted again. Respect flooded the silence. Eyes widened. The weight of titles and ranks filled the space between them. The officer blinked, confused. For the first time, doubt cracked his mask of arrogance. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. Because the woman he had mocked, the woman he had called trash, was about to reveal an identity that would shatter his confidence completely. And as he searched her face for answers, she simply stood there, calm, composed, unflinching. Waiting. The sound of footsteps grew louder, steady and deliberate, echoing against the pavement like a drumbeat. The officer shifted uneasily, but still clung to his arrogance, straightening his back, his hand brushing once again against his holster. To him, this was still a game of power. But then the figures appeared. Not one, not two, but several. Officers in clean uniforms, their badges glinting under the afternoon sun. They weren't rushing. They weren't panicked. They walked with the calm assurance of people who already knew exactly who they had come for. The crowd, which had nearly dispersed, stopped once more, curiosity pulling them back like magnets. Whispers rippled. Something was happening, something different from the usual street confrontation. The officer smirked, mistaking their approach for backup. Good, he muttered under his breath, someone who'll finally move her along. But when the first of them reached the sidewalk, their eyes didn't meet his. They went straight to her. And in that single moment, the world shifted. "Chief," one of them said, voice firm yet respectful, the word cutting through the tense air like a blade. "Are you all right?" Silence fell. The kind of silence that swallows sound, that makes the air feel heavier, thicker. The crowd froze. The officer blinked, his smirk collapsing into confusion. "Chief?" The word hung in the air like thunder. The woman he had mocked, the woman he had humiliated, the woman he had called trash, wasn't just anyone. She was the state police chief. She didn't answer right away. She didn't need to. Her silence now was louder than any outburst could have been. The other officers, realizing the scene before them, stood straighter, their faces tightening as the gravity of what had just occurred settled in. And finally, slowly, she turned her gaze back to the man who had tried to strip her dignity. For the first time, he looked uncertain. The swagger drained from his stance, replaced by something else: confusion, disbelief, the creeping edge of fear. His lips parted, as though to explain, but no words came. Because what excuse could cover what he had just done? What apology could erase the venom he had spewed? What authority could he cling to now that his own was crumbling in front of an audience? The chief took one step forward. Just one. But it was enough to turn the dynamic upside down. The officer, who had loomed over her moments before, now felt himself shrinking, his power unraveling strand by strand. "You called me trash," she said at last, her voice steady, low, deliberate. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. An indictment. He swallowed, his face flushing. I didn't. But his denial rang hollow. The crowd had heard. The bystanders who lingered had witnessed every second. And the officers standing behind her weren't blind to the truth. Her eyes didn't leave his. "You looked at me and saw nothing. But what you failed to see," she continued, her tone rising just enough to carry, "is everything I am, and everything I represent." Every word landed like a blow. Not shouted, not screamed, but spoken with the kind of authority that doesn't need volume to command silence. The officer's hands fidgeted at his sides. His breath quickened. The confidence he had worn like armor was now a crumbling mask. And then came the moment, the pivot that changed humiliation into triumph. One of the other officers, unable to stay silent, stepped forward. "Chief, do you want us to handle this?" Gasps rippled through the crowd. The bystanders, who only minutes earlier had seen a woman insulted and degraded, now realized they were standing witness to something rare, justice unfolding in real time. The chief held up her hand, stopping them. She didn't need anyone to fight her battles. Not now. Not after everything. She turned back to him, her expression unreadable. "Do you know what the badge means?" she asked. He didn't respond. "It means service. It means dignity. It means justice. And today, you dragged it through the dirt with your words." The crowd murmured, their voices hushed but charged with energy. The officer's chest heaved, his eyes darting between her, the other officers, and the crowd. He had no escape. No shield. No way to rewrite what had just happened. For a brief moment, he looked like a man who had fallen into his own trap. And maybe he had. But the chief didn't gloat. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't humiliate him the way he had humiliated her. She simply said, "The difference between us is simple. You wear that badge. I live it." The words hit harder than any punishment could. The officer staggered back a step, his face pale, his arrogance shattered. And yet, even as the balance of power shifted fully, the story wasn't finished. Because this wasn't just about him. It wasn't just about one man's failure. It was about the system that had enabled him, the culture that had emboldened him, the countless others who had gotten away with the same cruelty in silence. The chief knew this moment wasn't just personal. It was bigger. Much bigger. And as she looked past him, scanning the crowd, her voice carried a final statement, one that cut through every heart listening. "This isn't just about what he called me. It's about what too many are called every day, in ways small and large, hidden and exposed. The insult wasn't new. The story isn't rare. But what happens next, that is what matters." The crowd stood silent, waiting. The officer stared at the ground, unable to meet her eyes. And the other officers shifted uneasily, caught between loyalty and truth. The moment hung suspended, thick with unspoken judgment, charged with the weight of history. And then, with deliberate calm, the chief turned to walk away, leaving the officer standing alone in the wreckage of his arrogance. But as she stepped forward, the question lingered in the air. What would justice look like now? When she walked away from that confrontation, the air still heavy with silence, it wasn't victory she felt first. It was weight. Because even though she had exposed the officer's cruelty, even though the truth had flipped the power dynamic in an instant, she knew the story was bigger than one man. He was not the first to weaponize his authority against someone like her, and he would not be the last. The crowd slowly dispersed, carrying whispers with them. Some shook their heads, embarrassed by what they had witnessed. Others stared, stunned by the revelation that the woman called trash was actually the chief of state police. For many, it was a moment they would never forget, a moment that pulled the mask off casual racism and revealed the rot beneath. And yet, as she drove away later that evening, she couldn't shake a single question from her mind. What if she hadn't been the chief? What if she had been another black woman walking home from work? What if she had been a teenager, a mother, a grandmother with no title, no rank, no authority to shield her? Would her silence have been interpreted as defiance? Would her restraint have been met with violence instead of disbelief? Would she have made it home at all? That thought haunted her more than the insult itself. Because her protection that day didn't come from her humanity, it came from her title. And titles can't protect everyone. That was the deeper injustice. For her, the humiliation became a reminder of why she had chosen this path in the first place. She had worked her way to the top not just for personal achievement, but to carve out a space where dignity couldn't be denied. To create a system where authority meant accountability, not intimidation. But watching that officer, seeing the smug certainty in his eyes before the truth unraveled, she realized how far there was still to go. The badge, in his hands, had become a weapon. In hers, it had always been a promise. The difference between them wasn't just rank, it was purpose. In the days that followed, the story spread quietly but steadily. Within her department, it sparked difficult conversations. Officers who had once dismissed issues of bias now found themselves face to face with undeniable evidence. Leadership called for reviews, for training, for reforms that had too often been shelved or ignored. Some resisted, uncomfortable with change. Others welcomed the reckoning. But outside the walls of the institution, the story took on a life of its own. In neighborhoods where people had grown accustomed to silence, word of what had happened gave them something else: proof. Proof that even at the highest levels, racism didn't vanish. Proof that even those in positions of power could be reduced to stereotypes in a single glance. Proof that the struggle was not over. And for the chief, it became personal in a new way. She thought of the young women she mentored, the ones she told to walk with confidence, to speak with conviction, to never let anyone strip away their worth. How could she tell them that confidence was enough, when she herself had been dismissed as trash despite carrying the highest title in her state? The truth was harder. The truth was that confidence alone could not protect them. Only change could. And that is why the story matters. Because it isn't about one insult. It isn't about one officer's arrogance. It isn't even about one chief's vindication. It's about the system that allows prejudice to slip into uniforms, to masquerade as authority, to humiliate and endanger those it should protect. It's about the countless names we will never know, the people without titles, without platforms, without the shield of status, who face the same contempt in silence, who carry the same wounds unseen. So the real question is not, what happened to him? The real question is, what happens to us if we allow this to continue? Because racism is not always loud. Sometimes it's whispered. Sometimes it hides in the small dismissals, the subtle exclusions, the quiet insults muttered under the breath. And sometimes, as on that day, it explodes into the open, raw, and undeniable. But every time it appears, it leaves scars. And those scars don't just belong to individuals, they belong to communities, to generations, to the very soul of society. The chief knew this. That's why she didn't gloat. That's why she didn't celebrate the officer's downfall. Because the real battle wasn't about humiliating him. The real battle was about rebuilding a system that had allowed him to believe his cruelty was acceptable in the first place. As she reflected, one truth crystallized in her mind: change cannot wait for titles. Dignity cannot be conditional. Humanity cannot be ranked. She carried that truth with her into every meeting that followed, every decision she made, every reform she pushed for. And though progress would be slow, though resistance would be fierce, she carried the memory of that day as fuel. Not for her own pride, but for the countless others who didn't have the protection of a badge, the shield of a title, or the privilege of a public revelation. And now, the memory of her story belongs to you. Because whether you wear a uniform or not, whether you hold a title or not, you have a choice. To speak when silence would be easier. To see dignity where others see stereotypes. To demand justice when prejudice pretends to be authority. So the question is this: the next time you witness injustice, will you turn away, or will you stand in the silence and let your presence be the resistance? Because change doesn't start with a badge. It doesn't start with a rank. It starts with us. And maybe the real measure of justice isn't what happens when power is challenged, it's what happens when truth finally speaks louder than hate.